The morning after the HOA refused his repair bill, Garrett Hollis walked down to his grandfather's dam and placed his hand on a valve that hadn't been touched in 60 years. He didn't do it out of anger. He did it out of math. $63,000 in critical repairs, 120 homes that depended on his dam for their lake, $700,000 to $1.5 million per lakefront property, and a blonde woman in a white Escalade who'd told him, in front of the whole board, that his crumbling infrastructure was his problem alone. She thought she was calling his bluff. She didn't realize he wasn't bluffing. He was an engineer. Engineers don't bluff. They calculate. And the calculation said, if you won't pay to maintain the lake, you don't get to keep the lake. What happened next shook every property value in the community. Stay right here. Garrett Hollis was 47 years old and starting over. The divorce had been finalized 18 months earlier. His consulting firm, the thing he'd poured 15 years into, had gone to his ex-wife's lawyers like a piñata at a birthday party. What remained was the one thing she couldn't touch, his grandfather's property. The original 14 acres in the foothills of western North Carolina, with the old earthen dam that Everett Hollis had built with his own 2 hands back in 1961. Garrett came back to rebuild. His daughter Nora, 16, stayed with him every other week. They'd sit on the dock in the evenings, watching the water catch the light. It felt like forgiveness. Hawthorne Lake Estates was a private community of about 120 homes nestled in the foothills. The lakefront properties ran $700,000 to $1.5 million. It was quiet. It was beautiful. It was, in theory, the perfect place to disappear and start fresh. The dam was Garrett's inheritance in more ways than one. It wasn't just a structure. It was his grandfather's fingerprint on this valley. The earthen face had settled naturally over 60 years. The spillway, made of reinforced concrete, had handled everything from spring snowmelt to summer cloudbursts. But in early spring, when Garrett walked out with his engineer's eye, he saw what most people couldn't: hairline fractures running through the concrete like a spider web. The mortar between the spillway blocks was pulling away. Water was beginning to seep where it shouldn't. He called a structural engineer from Asheville. 3 days of core samples and calculations. The report came back in a formal PDF, with tables and charts and one number that hit different than the rest: $63,500. Emergency repairs. The spillway needed reinforcement, regrouting, waterproofing. The report noted, carefully, in the language engineers use, that failure could compromise the structural integrity of the entire dam system. The lake didn't exist without Garrett's grandfather's dam. 120 homes, swimming pools, boat launches, the entire reason this community had value. It all depended on a structure that Garrett now owned outright, and that was dying. He scheduled a meeting with the HOA board. Barbara Wyndham had been HOA president for 6 years. She was 58, always in coordinated outfits, pastels usually, with matching jewelry, and she drove a white Cadillac Escalade that she parked at angles in the community center lot, like she owned it. She did, in a sense. Her husband Vince was semi-retired, a real estate developer who'd made his money in the late 90s, and Barbara had since dedicated her life to making Hawthorne Lake Estates look like the kind of place that appeared in magazines. Garrett's property, by contrast, was rustic. It had wild brush and native oak trees, and a grandfather's house that looked lived in. It did not coordinate. The board meeting happened on a Tuesday evening in early April. The smell of the lake, that particular mixture of fish and water lilies and minerals, drifted through the open windows of the community center. Garrett brought 3 copies of the engineer's report. He presented the facts cleanly. He asked for a community cost-sharing solution. The board listened. Barbara smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then she laughed, not in a kind way. "Your dam, your problem," she said. The board voted 4-1 to reject his request. The fines started arriving 2 weeks later. First came the certified letter. Garrett's property was in violation of Section 4.2.1 of the Hawthorne Lake Estates Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. Unmaintained property presenting unsightly visual conditions. The fine was $250 per week until remedied. Then came another. The brush overgrowth near the eastern boundary was excessive. The wooden fence on the northern edge of his property was weathered beyond community standards. Another $250, then another. His dock, the same dock his grandfather had built, the dock Garrett's daughter sat on, was deemed a structural eyesore. They were coming fast now. 7 days apart. The certified letters piled up on his kitchen counter. By the end of May, Barbara had issued 11 violations, $2,750 in fines he hadn't authorized, for property he owned outright, sitting on a parcel that predated the HOA's entire existence. That last part was the crucial detail Garrett didn't fully understand until he hired a property rights attorney named Marcus Chen in Charlotte. Marcus took one look at the deed filed in 1962, the original deed, when Everett Hollis had formalized his ownership of the land, and told Garrett something that changed everything. "You might not be subject to the HOA covenants at all," Marcus said over the phone. "Properties that were platted before an HOA was formally established, especially if the original owners didn't explicitly opt into the covenants, sometimes exist in a legal gray zone. Did your grandfather ever sign an acceptance of the CC and Rs?" Garrett had no idea. He asked his mother. She found the old documents in a cedar chest, correspondence from 1972 from an HOA attorney requesting his grandfather's signature on a formal covenant acceptance. A note in pencil on the letter, in his grandfather's handwriting, "Not interested in their rules on my private land." He'd never signed. Garrett called Marcus back. "What does that mean?" "It means Barbara Wyndham has been issuing fines on properties she may have no legal authority to fine. It means your 14 acres might not be bound by the covenants at all. And it means her $2,700 fishing expedition just became very expensive for her." The water in the spillway made that particular hollow sound it always made in late May, the sound of early summer, of the lake expanding with spring runoff. Garrett stood on the dam's face and breathed in the mineral smell of the water, the earthy smell of the spillway's weathered concrete. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice. "Don't let them push you around." He sent Marcus's letter to Barbara the following Monday. It was polite, professional, devastating. It stated that Garrett's property predated the HOA's establishment, that he had never formally accepted the CC&Rs, and that the issued fines were therefore void and unenforceable. It further noted that Garrett was prepared to file a lawsuit to recover the fines already paid and to seek damages for the illegal lien threat that had appeared in the certified letter. Barbara's response came 3 days later, not from her directly, but from an HOA attorney in Raleigh, whose letterhead looked expensive. The letter was aggressive. It insisted the fines were valid. It accused Garrett of bad faith attempts to escape his obvious obligations to the community. But here's what Marcus had taught Garrett. When someone's attorney starts writing letters without doing their homework, it usually means they're nervous. It means they're not sure of their ground. Garrett framed Marcus's assessment on his kitchen wall next to his daughter's college acceptance letters. The principle was simple, and it applied to a lot of situations in life. If you don't know the rules of the game, you shouldn't be playing it. Barbara was playing with marked cards, and she didn't even know Garrett had learned the shuffle. Barbara escalated in early June. Garrett was at his office, a small consulting setup he ran from a converted outbuilding on the property, when the trucks arrived. 2 of them. A flatbed with surveying equipment and a silver pickup with the logo of a structural engineering firm from Greensboro emblazoned on the door. 4 people got out. No one knocked on his door. No one asked permission. They walked directly to the dam with clipboards and measuring tapes and began photographing the spillway. One of them placed a piece of equipment at the base of the concrete. They were taking core samples. Garrett walked over. He knew his tone would be dangerous, so he kept his voice level instead. "Who authorized this?" he asked. A man with a polo shirt and a professional smile turned around. "HOA assessment. We're evaluating structural..." "You're on private property. Who gave you permission to be here?" The smile faltered. "The HOA president said..." "The HOA president doesn't own this land. You need to leave." They left. Not happily, but they left. That evening, Garrett called a local sheriff's deputy named Reynolds, who'd been in his class at Hawthorne Lake High School 30 years ago. He filed a trespassing complaint. Reynolds took it seriously. Unauthorized entry onto private property was unauthorized entry, regardless of who'd asked them to do it. He filed a report. The engineering firm would receive a notice. Here's a point worth remembering. In most states, an HOA has no inherent authority to enter private property for inspections, unless that right is explicitly granted in the CC&Rs, and the property owner is legally bound by those covenants. If you never signed on to the HOA agreement, their inspection authority is just trespassing with a clipboard. But Barbara had already won the first part of her game. She'd called neighbors. Word spread through the community like spilled water. Garrett was hiding something on his property. The dam was dangerous. He was a safety risk. One of the neighbors, a woman named Carol, who lived 3 houses down from Garrett's parcel, mentioned it to her brother-in-law, who worked in the county assessment office. That brother-in-law mentioned it to someone at the county building department. By mid-June, the county building inspector, a man named Roland Stevens, showed up at Garrett's property. He was professional and methodical. He examined the dam, he examined the spillway, he took photographs. He used instruments Garrett recognized from his own toolbox, a level, a concrete depth gauge, a moisture meter. Then Stevens did something unexpected. He called Garrett over and pointed at the spillway. "How long has this been cracking?" "A few months," Garrett said. "I had a structural engineer assess it. $63,000 in repairs needed." Stevens nodded. "That sounds about right. This is pretty serious." He paused. "I've got to be honest with you. Whoever sent me here was hoping I'd condemn this structure. But I can't condemn private property just because someone doesn't like the guy who owns it. And technically, this isn't my jurisdiction. This dam is part of a private water system on private land. Unless there's been a failure, unless water is flooding into someone else's property, this is between you and the county health department." He pointed at a card in his wallet. "But here's the thing. I looked at the plat map. Your dam is the only water control structure for the entire lake. If it failed, you'd have a catastrophic situation on your hands, and all these people would lose their property. You need to get those repairs done." After Stevens left, Garrett sat on the dock. His daughter Nora wasn't there that week. She was with her mother, but he could almost see her sitting beside him. The evening light turned the lake the color of copper. He understood now what Barbara was trying to do, make him look like the villain. Make him the obstacle to the community's safety. Get him angry enough to make a mistake. He called Marcus instead. "She tried to have county condemn the property," Garrett said. "Did they?" Marcus asked. "No. Then she just gave us documentation that she's acting in bad faith. That's discovery material. That's the kind of thing juries remember." The water through the spillway made that hollow sound again. It sounded different now, like a warning, like counting down. July brought heat and desperation. Barbara organized a petition, 73 signatures from Hawthorne Lake residents demanding that Garrett make immediate repairs to the unsafe structure or grant the HOA authority to repair it at the owner's expense. The petition was framed and delivered to his mailbox in a plastic sleeve, like a certificate of betrayal. One of the signatories was Carol from 3 houses down, the neighbor Garrett had bought groceries for when her husband had his heart attack 2 years ago. The petition meant nothing legally, but it meant something socially. It meant Barbara had convinced most of the community that Garrett was the problem. She doubled down. At the next HOA meeting, attended by 47 residents in the community center with the lake smell drifting through the windows, Barbara stood up and announced that the HOA was exploring all available remedies, including whether North Carolina's eminent domain laws applied to community structures. Garrett learned about this from Marcus, who'd been monitoring the meeting minutes. "Eminent domain?" Garrett asked. "She can't do that." "No," Marcus said. "She absolutely cannot. Only government entities can exercise eminent domain, not private HOAs, not Barbara Wyndham. If she's publicly stated that she's pursuing this option, that's another piece of evidence that she's either operating in bad faith or doesn't understand the law she's supposed to be enforcing. Possibly both." 2 days later, a letter arrived on thick, cream-colored paper from Raleigh. It was from an attorney named David Castellano, retained by the HOA. The letter was polished and aggressive. It demanded that Garrett grant the HOA a utility easement over the dam and spillway system. It claimed the community had an implied right to access and maintain the structure. It threatened legal action if Garrett didn't comply within 14 days. 14 days. It was a deadline designed to make someone panic. Garrett brought the letter to Marcus in Charlotte. Marcus read it in silence, then smiled. Not a kind smile, but a satisfied one. "They just made a huge mistake," Marcus said. "They've put in writing that they want access to private property. They're threatening legal action to force a private property owner to grant them easement rights. Do you know what's interesting about your 1962 deed?" "What?" "There's an attached addendum. Your grandfather gave the original HOA the informal one from 1962, a revocable water license. The community gets to use the lake as long as they share maintenance costs. If they refuse the costs and threaten legal action, he included a revocation clause. That was in the original language. Marcus pulled up a scanned image on his computer. There it was, in typed letters from 1962. Water use privileges remain revocable if community members fail to contribute to reasonable maintenance costs. Revocable, Marcus repeated, as in, you can revoke it. As in, the second they refused your bill and decided to be hostile, they lost their rights to the lake. Garrett stared at the words. He thought about his grandfather sitting at a desk in 1962, thinking 60 years into the future, trying to protect what he'd built. That same week, Barbara had the landscaping crew install a new flower bed right in front of the community mailbox cluster. It was technically placed on HOA common ground, but it effectively blocked easy access to Garrett's mailbox. It was a small aggression. It was petty. It was exactly the kind of thing Barbara did when she was running out of real moves. Garrett stood in the evening light, looking at the dam his grandfather had built. The concrete was cracked. The water was rising with summer rain. The lake was beautiful and vulnerable, and entirely dependent on a structure that the community had just decided to threaten instead of maintain. He thought about the revocation clause. He thought about what happened when an entire community of expensive lakefront properties suddenly realized they'd made a very expensive mistake. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "I want to understand exactly what we can do here," Garrett said, "and I want to understand it completely." Marcus's voice was calm, measured, and full of quiet satisfaction. "Let's talk about revocation," he said. Marcus Chen sat across from Garrett at a coffee shop in Asheville, reading glasses perched on his nose, 2 pages of the 1962 deed spread across the laminate table. Outside, late spring rain drummed against the windows. Marcus looked up. "Do you understand what you actually own here?" Garrett didn't answer immediately. He was staring at a highlighted passage. "That revocable water license," Marcus continued, "is the entire foundation of this community. Not an easement, not a covenant, a license. And licenses, by definition, can be revoked by the person who granted them. Your grandfather granted it. That means you inherited the ability to take it back." The coffee shop noise seemed to fade. Garrett felt the weight of what Marcus was saying settle into his chest. "So the lake is yours to control," Marcus finished. "Completely. The HOA uses the lake only as long as you permit them to. The moment you revoke that license, the water rights evaporate. Legally speaking, you have the authority to drain that lake whenever you want." Garrett looked out the window. He'd driven past Hawthorne Lake hundreds of times since inheriting the land. He'd never thought of it as his. It was just there, part of the landscape, part of the community. "What happens to the homeowners?" Garrett asked. Marcus removed his glasses. "That depends on you, but hypothetically, those 700,000 to 1.5 million lakefront properties become $300,000 houses next to a mud pit. The lake is their entire value proposition. Without it, they're sitting on expensive dirt. The numbers hit different now." Garrett had been thinking in terms of his repair bill, his legal fees, the principle of the thing. But this was leverage he didn't know he had. "Your grandfather," Marcus said quietly. "He must have known this. That's why he kept the property separate. That's why he never signed those CC&Rs. I think he saw this coming a long way off." Garrett pulled out his phone and looked at the deed photograph again. Everett Hollis, born 1918, died 1994. A man who'd survived the Depression, 2 wars, and a changing world. A man who'd protected his land with the same care you'd protect a loaded gun, kept it close, kept it safe, and hoped it would never need to be fired. "He left me a nuclear option," Garrett said, "and I didn't even know it." "Not nuclear," Marcus corrected. "Legal, perfectly legal. A revocable license exists at the pleasure of the grantor. You're not doing anything illegal by exercising your property rights. The state of North Carolina will back you up on this." They sat in silence for a moment. Rain continued its rhythm against the glass. "Barbara has no idea," Garrett said finally. "None," Marcus agreed. "She thinks she can bully you into submission because she runs the HOA. She has no idea that she's been living on borrowed water this entire time. Water that only flows because you allow it. Garrett set down his coffee. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. For the first time since Barbara Wyndham had said, "Your dam, your problem," Garrett understood exactly what those words meant. They meant everything. The legal revocation notice took Marcus 3 days to draft. It was 14 pages of precise, elegant language. Not angry, not threatening, just clear. As of 30 days from filing, the revocable water license granted to the Hawthorne Lake HOA and its predecessors is hereby revoked by the legal property holder. Garrett read it twice, made one small edit, and they filed it with the county recorder's office on a Thursday morning. Marcus called him that afternoon. "It's recorded," he said simply. "It's official. 30 days. 30 days to turn a community inside out." Garrett didn't waste them. First, he contacted the North Carolina Dam Safety Program. A different engineer this time, not Barbara's people, not his people, just the state's people. They sent an inspector out the following Monday. This time, the inspection report wasn't buried. Garrett got a digital copy within 48 hours. The findings were worse than the first report. Seepage in a new section, structural stress from standing water, estimated repairs, $64,200. The state inspector added a handwritten note. Recommend immediate action. Liability exposure significant if failure occurs. Insurance against any accusation that he was being unreasonable. Second, Garrett installed security cameras, 4 of them, positioned to cover the dam perimeter, the spillway, and the access roads. Industrial-grade equipment. He mounted them on metal poles and aimed them at the sky like they were guarding something sacred, because he was. He was documenting every frame of what came next. Third, he researched North Carolina's controlled drawdown procedures. It turned out you couldn't just open a spillway valve and let chaos happen. There were fish relocation protocols, environmental considerations, permit requirements. Under NC dam safety regulations, dam owners have specific rights and responsibilities. The state can order repairs but cannot force others to pay for private infrastructure. Garrett spent 2 evenings reading state guidelines, contacting the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. They were helpful, accommodating. When he explained the situation, community refused to pay for repairs, he was exercising his property rights. Nobody said he couldn't do it. They just said if he was going to lower the lake, he needed to do it responsibly. Garrett ordered a fish tank, 300 gallons. He researched how to humanely relocate the largemouth bass and bluegill that called Hawthorne Lake home. He wasn't a villain in this story, and he wasn't going to let his leverage turn him into one. Fourth, he rented equipment, a portable pump station, marking tape, protective barriers. He went down to the dam on a Wednesday afternoon, alone, deliberately, and marked out the spillway system, the main valve, the secondary valve, the control mechanisms that, for 62 years, had been sitting quietly, taking orders from nobody but him. Fifth, he called James Whitfield, a journalist at the Asheville Citizen-Times, who covered community disputes and HOA conflicts. Garrett didn't offer details. He just said, "Something's about to happen out at Hawthorne Lake. You might want to pay attention." Sixth, he prepared his own documentation. He scanned the 1962 deed. He photographed the property records. He made copies of every letter Barbara had sent, every trespassing contractor's invoice, every fine notice. He organized it all chronologically and created a simple 1-page summary. Timeline of events, repair request to revocation notice. Just the facts, just the sequence. None of this was aggressive. It was methodical. It was what a civil engineer does: assess, plan, document, execute. His daughter Nora found him in the garage on the Friday before the drawdown, testing the pump station's pressure gauges. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Making sure everything works," he said simply. "When you're about to change something this significant, you don't guess, you verify. Every system, every pressure point. You understand what's about to happen before you let it happen." She watched him work for a minute, then said, "You're not angry about this anymore, are you?" Garrett looked up from the gauges. "No," he said. "Angry is what Barbara was when I wouldn't cave. This is different. This is just inevitable." The legal filing appeared in the county records database on Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, Barbara Wyndham had called an emergency board meeting. Garrett wasn't invited, but he heard about it within hours. A neighbor texted him. "They know. They're freaking out." The HOA's response was predictable. They lawyered up. Barbara's attorney, a different one, younger, with a reputation for being aggressive, immediately filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order, requesting that the court block the revocation and any subsequent water level changes. The motion was denied on Monday morning. The judge's response was brief. Plaintiff has failed to demonstrate that the defendant's exercise of documented property rights constitutes an irreparable harm. Motion denied. By Monday afternoon, Barbara had changed tactics. She sent Garrett a letter, $10,000, a settlement offer. The letter spoke about community relations and finding common ground and the importance of neighborly cooperation. $10,000, 16% of the repair bill. It was an insult wrapped in a business envelope. Garrett filed it in his desk drawer without responding. But Barbara didn't stop there. She started posting on Nextdoor long, panicked messages about how Garrett was holding the community hostage and extorting homeowners and putting private property interests above public safety. She created an online petition to protect Hawthorne Lake from private property exploitation, and got 63 signatures. The comments section became an echo chamber of fear and anger, mostly from people who'd never met him. "He's a greedy developer," one post read. "He's trying to destroy the lake for profit," another said. "This is what happens when you let outsiders get property control," a third contributed. Garrett read none of it. He had Nora set up email filters. He didn't want the noise. What he did care about were the 3 messages he received on Tuesday evening from board members. Private messages. Anonymous email addresses. They all said similar things. "This is Barbara's war, not ours. We voted against her position. We wanted to pay the repair bill. We're sorry you have to do this." One of them, he never found out which, added, "If we'd known about that 1962 deed, we would have settled this months ago. Barbara hid it from us. That information was valuable. That information meant the board was fracturing." On Wednesday, as Barbara escalated her social media campaign and sent yet another letter through her attorney, this one demanding he cease and desist the planned illegal drawdown, Garrett did something that surprised people who knew him. He smiled. Not a cruel smile, not a satisfied one, just a clear-eyed recognition that he was watching a house of cards understand, for the first time, that the wind was coming. He documented everything Barbara sent, every Nextdoor post, every board email forwarded to him by concerned residents, every news story that started circulating about the lake house dispute and HOA president versus property owner. He made copies. He made backups. He kept his phone clean. No angry texts, no heated responses, no public statements. When Marcus called on Thursday to ask how he was holding up, Garrett said, "Better than I have since this started. We're past the point of her controlling the narrative now. Events are about to do that for us." "You sound calm," Marcus observed. "I am calm," Garrett replied. "I'm not worried about what Barbara's going to say anymore. I'm focused on what the lake is about to do, and that's something she can't stop." After they hung up, Garrett stood on his porch, looking down at the lake in the late afternoon sun. It still looked perfect, still looked pristine, still looked permanent. He knew better. 30 days had become 2. The 30-day notice period expired on a Monday morning. Garrett marked the calendar in red. He didn't open a champagne bottle or call anyone. He just walked down to the dam with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the spillway valve. The water level was still high, still beautiful, still worth $1.5 million per house. He placed his hand on the valve lever and took a breath. Then he began to turn it. The sound was mechanical, practical. A lever rotating, gears engaging. A system designed decades ago finally being asked to do something other than sit and wait. The spillway gate began to open. Water rushed through with a roar that echoed off the landscape. The sound was louder than Garrett expected, louder than he was ready for, just loud. The sound of control being exercised, the sound of inevitability made audible. He didn't open it all the way. He opened it maybe 30%, enough that the water would flow out faster than rain and creek-fed inflow could replace it, enough that the level would begin dropping measurably within hours, enough that everyone would notice. By Tuesday evening, the first calls came in. Residents complaining that their boats were tilting. Docks were sitting higher than the water. Something was wrong with the lake level. By Wednesday morning, the water had dropped 4 inches. By Thursday, another 4. By Friday, 8 more. The pattern was clear: 6 inches per day, give or take. Controlled, measurable, relentless. Garrett opened the spillway a little wider. 10 inches per day. The sensory reality of a draining lake is something you don't fully understand until you see it happen. The smell was the worst part. Not all at once, but building. That rich, rotten stench of exposed lake bottom, rotting vegetation, disturbed mud, the mulch of 60 years of decay that had been submerged and anaerobic. Fish struggling in shallow water, decomposing algae, the smell of a world that wasn't meant to breathe fresh air. The sound was different too. No longer the gentle lap of water against docks. Instead, the scrape of boats dragging across gravel, the crack of mooring ropes going slack, the slurp and squelch of mud being exposed, yard by yard, foot by foot. A realtor friend of Garrett's, someone he trusted, called him on Friday afternoon. "Properties are already down," she said quietly. "Some of the waterfront homes have dropped 200 grand in comp value. Buyers are pulling offers. People are panicking." The lake dropped another 14 inches that weekend. On Sunday evening, Garrett received a phone call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. When he did, the voice on the other end was male, measured, professional. "Garrett, this is Vince Wyndham, Barbara's husband, the real estate developer, the one who'd invested heavily in lakefront development, the one whose portfolio was currently evaporating." "I'm calling on my own," Vince continued. "Barbara doesn't know. I need to know what it would take for you to stop this." Garrett stood on his porch. The sun was setting. The lake was visibly lower than it had been that morning. He could see exposed shoreline now, muddy, ugly, strewn with rocks and algae-covered logs. "Pay the $63,500, Garrett said, "plus my legal fees, $18,000. Get the board to authorize it. Get it done before the middle of next week." Silence on the other end. Then, "That's a lot of money." "It's exactly the money you said wasn't your problem," Garrett replied. "But now it's everyone's problem. So yes, that's what it costs." Another pause. Vince was doing math in his head. $40,000 in home value loss per property. 68 lakefront properties affected. His own holdings worth roughly $3 million. $3 million evaporating because his wife said no to $63,000. "I'll talk to Barbara," Vince said finally. "You do that," Garrett replied, and he hung up. The lake dropped another foot that night. By Monday morning, the community was in open panic. People were calling county commissioners. People were posting frantic messages online. People were beginning to understand that they didn't actually control this lake. Garrett did. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. in the community center gymnasium. The message went out at 6 a.m. All residents invited. Critical community matter. By 6:45 p.m., the parking lot was full. Cars lined the street. People were standing outside because there was no more room inside. 93 residents, according to the fire marshal who showed up to monitor capacity. 93 people who'd bought into the dream of Hawthorne Lake and were now watching that dream recede into mud. Barbara Wyndham stood at the podium in a red blazer, her blonde hair taut, her jaw tight. She'd called the meeting hoping to take control of the narrative. It didn't work that way. "I want to address the current situation with our water levels," she began, her voice sharp. "The problem is not the HOA. The problem is one individual who is using our shared resource as a weapon." Garrett was already standing. He wasn't in the front. He was in the middle, flanked by Marcus Chen on one side. On the other side stood a woman with professional camera equipment, Sarah Hendricks, Asheville Citizen-Times. She was filming everything. "Excuse me," Garrett said quietly. "I have some information to share with this community." The gymnasium went silent. 200 eyes locked on him. "I'm Garrett Hollis," he continued. His voice was steady, no anger, just clarity. "I own the property that the dam sits on. I own the water rights. I inherited them from my grandfather in 1994. Before I say anything else, I want to be clear about something. I came to this community with a solution. The dam needs repairs. I got estimates, $63,500. I presented that to the HOA board and asked for cost sharing. He pulled out a folder. He held up the original estimate, the laminated copy so people could see it from the back of the gym. The response I received was, "Your dam, your problem." He paused and let that sink in. After that, he continued, the HOA sent trespassing contractors to my property. They tried to get the county to condemn my home. They organized petitions. The president threatened eminent domain. And when I exercised my legal property rights, they sent letters accusing me of extortion and hostage-taking. Marcus stood and distributed copies of the 1962 deed, copies of the revocation notice, copies of the North Carolina Dam Safety Program's second inspection report, copies of the court's denial of the temporary restraining order. What you're looking at, Garrett said, is 62 years of documented property rights. That lake exists because my family permits it to exist. That's not opinion, that's law. That's the deed your community is built on. Sarah Hendricks filmed the crowd's reaction, the confusion, the dawning understanding. I didn't want to do this, Garrett said, and his voice carried genuine weight. I wanted to repair the dam. I wanted to protect the lake. I wanted to keep it as a community resource. All I asked was that everyone chip in to maintain shared infrastructure. Instead, I was told no. He looked directly at Barbara. I never wanted a war. I wanted $63,500 in repairs to protect your lake. You said no, so I started protecting my property instead. And it turns out, when you protect a dam, you control a lake. He let that hang for a moment. I could drain it completely, he added. Legally, I could, but I don't want to. I want the same thing I wanted 6 months ago. I want the dam repaired and the lake protected. I want to be part of this community, not at war with it. A voice called from the back. What do we have to do? Pay the repair bill, Garrett said. All of it, plus my legal fees. Authorize it as a community. Get the dam fixed before fall. After that, we can talk about a maintenance fund so this never happens again. The room erupted, not in anger, in confusion, in people turning to look at Barbara, wondering how they got here, how their president had walked them straight into catastrophe. A board member Garrett had never met stood up. Motion to remove Barbara Wyndham as HOA president, effective immediately. A second voice. I second. The vote took 3 minutes. It was 91-2. Barbara left the room without speaking. Her blazer was still perfectly pressed, but her face had gone the color of wet concrete. The new board president, a woman named Diane who'd voted against Barbara from the start, called for a vote on paying Garrett's repair bill in full, plus legal fees. It was unanimous. The gymnasium erupted again, and this time it sounded different. It sounded like relief. The dam was repaired by August 15th. A certified crew, approved by the state, working methodically through the summer heat. Garrett stood on his porch some mornings and watched them work. He didn't interfere. He didn't offer advice. He just made sure they had what they needed and that the work was done right. By September, the lake was full again. The water level had returned to normal. The docks were level. The boats were floating properly. Hawthorne Lake looked like it had never been threatened at all, except for the raw new concrete on the dam and the fresh riprap along the shoreline. The community, for the first time since Garrett had inherited the property, was united. The Hawthorne Lake Dam Maintenance Fund was established in October, $200 per household, per year. It wasn't revolutionary. It was what should have been there the entire time. But now it was formal, documented, binding. Garrett donated a 3-acre strip of woodland around the dam to the community. He deeded it as permanent public green space, subject to a conservation easement. That land would never be developed. It would always be protected. He named it the Everett Hollis Trail, after his grandfather, the man who'd seen this entire conflict coming 60 years before it started. His daughter Nora organized a lake cleanup day that first spring after the repairs. She got 47 residents to participate. They pulled decades of debris from the shoreline. Old fishing lures, abandoned dock pieces, tires, bottles, the accumulated garbage of a forgotten lake bottom. It became an annual event. Eventually, it was sponsored by the county. Eventually, it was covered by local media as one of the area's most popular volunteer initiatives. Garrett started a consulting firm 2 years later, Hollis Dam Safety. He worked with rural communities across western North Carolina, places with old dams, aging infrastructure, and genuine disputes about who was responsible for what. He helped them understand their legal positions before conflicts spiraled into wars. He saved communities from becoming what Hawthorne Lake almost became. It was meaningful work. It paid well. It was the kind of thing his grandfather would have approved of. Barbara sold her house and moved to Charleston. She became someone else's problem. Vince stayed. He and Garrett eventually became cordial. Not friends exactly, but neighbors who understood each other. They'd see each other at community meetings, and there was no animosity, just acknowledgement. One evening in June, 2 years after the drawdown, Garrett sat on his dock with Nora. The sun was setting. The lake was full and glassy, reflecting the mountains. A family of geese was paddling near the far shore. The water smelled like water, clean, alive, natural. "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked, "pulling the trigger on all of it?" Garrett thought about that. He thought about the anger, the legal battles, the fear that he'd made a terrible mistake, the moment when he'd opened the spillway valve and heard that roar. "No," he said finally. "I regret that it had to happen, but I don't regret that it did happen. Your grandfather understood something that I had to learn the hard way. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to protect what matters." Nora smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "The lake looks perfect right now," she said. "It does," Garrett agreed. "And it'll stay that way, because now people understand what's at stake." The sun finished setting, the lake went dark, and in the darkness, Garrett could hear something he'd rarely heard in the years before, the sound of a community that understood the price of peace. If you've ever had an HOA try to take control of something that wasn't theirs, drop your story in the comments. We read every single one, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because next week, we've got a story about a man whose HOA fined him for the color of his front door, and what happened when he painted every single door on the block the same shade of bright yellow. You don't want to miss that one.
Here's what I want you to take away from this one. Barbara Whiteheim didn't lose because Garrett was richer or louder or meaner. She lost because she's confused authority with ownership. She ran that HOA like she owned the lake, the land, and every decision that touched them. But she never once checked the deed. She never asked who actually controlled the water. And when someone showed up with a legitimate request and a reasonable number, she laughed at him. That's where the real mistake, not the fines, not the trespassing, the laugh. Because Garrett wasn't the kind of man who forgot being laughed at. He was the kind of who went home, called a lawyer, and read every document his grandfather ever signed. The lesson is simple. Preparation beats power every single time. Documentation beats volume. Patience beats panic. And if you're going to pick a fight with someone over their own property, you better make sure you actually know what they earn. If you've ever had an HOA push you around, tell us your story in the comments. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and stick around because the next week we've got a story about a man who got fined for the color of his front door. What he did next turn, the whole block bright yellow. You're not going to want to miss it.